And I think we're recording now. So, uh, welcome back, viewers, to this is our fifth video on problems facing American democracy. Last week, we talked about Donald Trump and the Republican Party. This week, we move into Congress and we talk about a very important piece of legislation that is in the process of being worked through Congress. The abbreviation right now is HR1, House of Representatives 1, but it also has the more dramatic title of For the People Bill. It's a bill now. If it passes, it'll become an act. But right now it's a bill which has been passed by the House of Representatives, and now will go to the Senate. So, Anders, this was your suggestion for a topic to discuss. So what is this HR1? Sounds very undramatic. And why is it important? Give us an introduction.
Well, first of all, it's like we talked about before you started recording. This is something that people probably should be talking more about. And that's probably the main reason why we're talking about this today.
Uh-huh.
It's a comprehensive overhaul of voting rights in America. It's the most comprehensive voting rights bill since the civil rights era in 1965.
Right.
And this actually passed the House 2 years ago, back in 2019. But at that point, Mitch McConnell, our old friend, wasn't willing to even let it on the Senate floor for discussion. And the reason for that is probably that this bill has huge support among the American population, at least by potential voters answering polls. Like 2/3 of Americans support this bill, and even like 56% of Republicans support this, according to polls. So it's a hugely popular bill aiming at providing free and fair elections, which all Americans speaking in public claim to want. So it kind of makes sense that McConnell wouldn't even let people discuss this in public.
But it seems all rather, I mean, free and fair elections, isn't that something that one should take for granted when you're living in a democracy? I mean, we're not having that discussion in Sweden, isn't there? There's not a big debate about whether or not to have free or fair elections. I mean, we sort of assume that they are, in fact, free and fair, but...
Yeah, the fight for voting rights has been a bit more dramatic in America than in Sweden. There are some commonalities, but it's quite a different story all in all. But the bill, like what it is basically it's this 800-page behemoth, targeting mainly like when it comes to voting rights, it targets mainly voter disenfranchisement and gerrymandering. And I don't know, maybe we should start with the gerrymandering bit. The proposal in the bill is for independent election bodies made up of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 5 independents, 5 non-partisan members. And the way it's supposed to work is these people sit around, draw up election districts, election maps, and then they vote on them. And in order for an election district to be approved as like an actual district, when it comes time to vote, it has to have a majority of votes and at least one partisan vote and one independent vote. which would take away the possibility of gerrymandering. And do you want to explain what gerrymandering is and what it's about?
Yes, that's one of my favorite topics because I used to teach about because it's so much fun. But before we get to that, can talk about how boundaries are drawn today in America, because this is a rather strange. I mean, in most democracies, I think about Great Britain that I taught about as well. You have a independent commission that meets every few years, I forget how often, and they look at the country and they look at the boundary lines and how many people are living where and so forth, and they try to adjust the constituency boundaries to be, approximately 60,000 people or something, and regardless of what the party think, but there's an overview by the central government in this case. In America, you've never had this overview by the federal government of how boundary lines are drawn. Instead, it's been up to the states, although it does not have to be up to the states, but that's been the tradition and also the problem, that each of the 50 states decides how the boundary lines are going to be drawn in their state, which means that if you have a Republican state government, the Republican Party will redraw the boundary lines. If you have a Democratic state government, the Democratic Party will draw the boundaries line. And it almost seems, oh, wait a second, doesn't that open up for some sort of corruption here? And maybe the Republican legislature will draw them to. And of course, that's what's happened. It's happened throughout American history. It's a time-honored tradition. Today, there's a lot of talk about time-honored traditions in the Senate. Well, this is one time-honored tradition in America, and it has to be changed. There's just so much corruption involved, and both parties have been part of it. So this is one of the really both surprising and very strong parts of this bill. Is that no, the federal government is going to do it. So that's even on a good day, this is the way things work, that the individual state and the party in power in a state decides how the boundaries are being drawn, and they would do so to benefit their own party, not only in the state elections, but in the federal elections. Okay, then you have this term gerrymandering, which goes back to the beginning of the 19th century in Boston, in Massachusetts. And I think he was governor, Eldridge Gerry. And he again, the whole history of voting rights or the lack of voting rights in America, or how voting rights are manipulated and suppressed, is an interesting topic in itself. But he found out a way that he could redraw boundaries around Boston to support his party, who was a Democrat. And so instead of an objective sort of, 100 people in each district voting for, now he could redraw the boundary lines in a very creative manner so that his opponent would get as many votes as his party got, but they'd only get half the seats. Because he would take his district and then divide it into several smaller districts. So, and this is, and the result is, and you can see this if you look at it on the internet, this very strange construction, the way the boundaries were drawn around Boston, and it looks like a salamander or a dragon sort of devouring Boston. And it's a very interesting visual representation. And so you had Jerry, the governor's name, and salamander, and it became gerrymandering. And it has being ironic again, but a time-honored position in American politics. And now it's been taken to such extremes, this weird drawing of boundary lines, that it's just, I was going to say laughable, but it's horrible. A few years ago, I forget where it was. I might have mentioned this to you when we were doing a video last summer. But there was one town, I think it was in the South, doesn't really matter. But the boundary lines had been drawn in such a crazy fashion that a voters' rights group in this town decided to have a 5K fundraising event. And it would follow the path of the boundary line. It made no sense whatsoever. A good time was had by all. But this is the sort of thing, so it's plagued American democracy, should have no part in a democracy. And one of the things this act will do would be to replace the system um, with a federal mandate. And it's very interesting. You say, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 5 independents. And so you want to arrive in an objective way of drawing boundary lines. But there's pushback to this as well, isn't there? Not everybody is happy about this.
No, of course, there's going to be opposition. Like you said, the results of the current system are quite absurd. Important. Like, for example, at the moment, the Senate is split 50-50, 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats, but the 50 Democrats represent 60% of the populace, and the Republicans represent 40%. So, like, when one part of any system benefits from this kind of thing, of course, there's going to be opposition from them when it comes to reforming the system.
Yeah.
But there's not going to be opposition only from Republicans, I think. Like, there's like you said, this isn't like one of those issues where one side is guilty and one is innocent.
No.
Democrats engage in this kind of thing as well.
Yeah.
And I think that like under the current system, there's a lot of safe seats around the country where beforehand that because of the way districts are drawn,
right,
a Democrat is going to win this district,
right,
and a Republican is going to win this district,
right,
and this provides job security for a lot of politicians.
right,
And if you know that reforming the system might mean that you might lose your seat, that you're going to have like real competition,
right.
then you might not
Exactly.
be as willing to reform it. But the most important thing to remember here is like the massive support for
Right.
this from
Again, yeah.
the voters and from the people the system is meant to represent. And I
Right.
think, like, on a longer time frame, it's going to be disastrous if politicians don't listen to the people on this.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't
So
think.
yeah.
Yeah. No. Sorry. Go ahead.
No. So I mean, it's really important that it's passed. As to say, I mean, more and more people are becoming aware that the system doesn't work. Like where you have the Democrats going to win there, Republican. So if you're say a liberal-minded Republican or whatever, but you're a Republican, you think you can appeal to the people in your area, but it's a safe Democratic seat. You don't have a chance. So what's the point in even trying to get support there, and vice versa? Um, and maybe there's enough people. This has been going on for so long. And I think, like many other things, sort of accelerated by the Corona crisis, the Trump presidency, and the attack on Congress people themselves, not just the building, the people started, well, maybe, it wouldn't be such a bad idea. And the opposition that I mentioned, I mean, it's the opposition I've read has come from Republicans in Congress, which it's debatable how representative they are of their constituents. So, and people are discussing this now. So it's even though it was stopped by the self-proclaimed Darth Vader, McConnell, the Republican Party, 2 years earlier, this it might have better prospects to. Well, there certainly will be a discussion anyway. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in the Senate. And if it's not passed, then
Yeah.
well,
But I'll maybe we should get back to that, because
okay.
I don't think this has a great chance of passing, but
Uh-huh.
like, unfortunately, for very dumb reasons.
Okay.
Save that for last, maybe. Like,
No,
you
you
mentioned.
said take it now. Why don't you think
Oh,
it'll
no,
pass?
okay, sure,
Yeah.
we'll do it now. Like, the problem is this is gonna get filibustered. Uh, it's never going to get 10 Republicans backing it.
No.
I don't think, because the stakes are so high for the Republican Party. They stand to lose so much as a party. Joe Manchin, another one of our old friends, and also Kirsten Sinema have both come out against getting rid of the filibuster.
Right.
Joe Manchin famously screamed at some journalist that, "Jesus Christ, don't you understand never?" when asked when he would
Haven't you heard
consider.
me before? You know,
Yeah.
seriously. Yeah.
So I mean, he's basically nailed his political career to the idea of never getting rid of the filibuster. The only way to potentially pass this is to make exceptions to the filibuster rules.
Right.
Like I saw some suggestion that you could possibly write in the Senate rules that the filibuster can't be engaged when it comes to questions of democracy and voting rights and stuff. I mean, sure, if you do it that way, but you still have to get Manchin and Sinema and possibly others on board with it. I mean, you need all those 50 Democrats.
Plus,
and like it's not hopeless. It could happen, but I'm not terribly optimistic about.
But you're supposed to represent the sort of more cynical view, and I represent the more utopian view. So, although these positions don't always hold, but no, I think one of the things I thought unexpectedly I found really interesting about this bill was that, in fact, the filibuster was being discussed again. And we talked about the filibuster and the negative effect it has on democracy. We talked about that in an earlier video. So I was happy that it has come up for discussion now. And you're right. I mean, the way the rules apply now, you would have to have 60 votes, which is impossible. But there are ways of getting around the filibuster. You mentioned one, because exceptions can be made to the filibuster. One is like Supreme Court nominees and cabinet appointees. Then you only need a simple majority. That's okay. And then for budget reconciliation, something to do with the budget, that's okay to have a simple majority. Well, you just add on exception. And then the one proposed that you mentioned, for democracy issues, an exception, simple majority. Well, the more exceptions you have, the more ridiculous this becomes.
That's a good point.
But I remember in our earlier video, I think I mentioned, because a filibuster was used, this is something even commentators in America have been listening more recently about this act forget about. The filibuster was used basically to try to stop the Civil Rights Act of '64. There's nothing about minority party rights or all this ridiculousness that you can hear even on the major networks in America, and nothing to do with that. It was to stop voting rights for Black people in America. So we got that cleared up. But what was I going to say? Yeah, there's another, when we talked about it earlier, I said, I sort of threw out that, well, hey, you at least make people talk, talk for days and days and, do that anyway. And I was happy to see that other people have taken this up online, and even Joe Manchin. So Joe Manchin and I are on the same page about this.
Wonderful. No, but
Politics makes strange bedfellows. I don't think he heard our webcast, but he says, but make it make so people suffer, make them actually talk.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, talking talking in another sense. It's good that people are talking about the filibuster. Like that's a good point that you made. Looking at it that way, like there's nothing bad about this bill being introduced in Senate. It's all good. Only good things can come out of this, and I think that, like I said, I'm kind of pessimistic about the possibilities of passing this at the moment.
I should have said pessimist into cynic, not cynic, pessimist. Yeah, sorry.
Even if it doesn't pass now, just getting people talking about this,
Right,
like people are going to have to explain why they don't support this.
right,
And
exactly.
if people profess to support this and it goes down due to a filibuster, then people are going to have to re-examine that system as well. So
Oh,
that's a good point, and I feel a bit better now about it.
yeah, well, now I'm going to bring you back down to reality, because there's always a fall to reality from utopia. I mean, the problem with that is, in this specific case, is that this bill needs to be passed um, very, very quickly,
Yeah.
because because it'll have impact on the 2022 elections. So in order to get boundaries redrawn in a democratic fashion, to apply in 2022, it would have to be passed now. Um, but there's other ways of getting around this. But I think the idea of making people just in general to talk and defend why they don't want to have voter registration and things like that, I think it could be very, very educational for the American people. And you can't just stand there like before and read names out of a telephone book. Or you can do that. You can do that. But I mean, your voters back home, you, you might find yourself primaried in the next election. But
Yeah.
another thing is that this is a minor thing perhaps, but it's also interesting. It came from a Republican commentator and activist. And so, well, instead of having to have 60 votes to stop a filibuster, why not have demand 41 votes from the party that wants to have the filibuster, which would mean that they would have to vote, and then their names would be on record. These,
Okay.
because they don't have to do that now. For example, it would be the Democrats would have to get 60 votes. No, and the Republicans can get 41 votes for a filibuster. But the way it is now, they don't have to. It's not me, but I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't really change anything. But it's an interesting. Um, no,
It forces people to go on the
exactly. It forced
record.
people to go on record. Yeah,
Yeah, and that's probably, like, in some cases, the determining factor. Like,
yeah,
as long as you can deny your bad
exactly.
votes, then there's easy to take them. But like, speaking of voter disenfranchisement,
Yeah,
that's another thing in this bill, uh, and this is probably like the big one,
right,
aside from redistricting. This bill will make federal automatic voter registration a thing. And this is like, you're better with the history than I am, but this is kind of a big deal, because refusing people registration has uh, that historically, that's been one of the main ways to refuse people the right to vote.
right.
Um, and, like,
Trying to find my, yeah, yeah, it's I mean, there's been a lot of talk during the Trump administration about voter registration, passing laws to make it more difficult for people to vote, which are exactly like the laws that existed in the South up until 1964, where you would say that, you have to be able to write the Declaration of Independence or recite it or do all sorts of crazy things. If you were a black person, if you're a white person, you could be illiterate and still vote. And I mean, in a way, nothing wrong with that. But I mean, the rules were applied differently. But yeah, and since Trump was thrown out of office, basically, there's been more than 100 attempts and or measures put forward in Republican-controlled states to make it more difficult to vote. And that, I think, might be something which is difficult for non-Americans to understand. I mean, if that happened no, I mean,
no, like, it is difficult to understand. Like, it took
it
me
is
a
difficult.
long time to actually understand what is this voter registration.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Okay, it's being put on the actual voter roll, which you
Right.
check off when you go voting. That's the thing.
Yeah,
And like here in Sweden, that's all done automatically.
exactly.
Like if you have the right to vote, then you're on the voter rolls. The
Exactly.
government takes care of like
Right.
doing the paperwork for you, and all you have to do is just show up on election
Yeah.
day, basically. But
Yeah.
in the United States, it can take some effort to to be put on the rolls.
Exactly. And then, as we've talked about earlier, and I'm of a much older generation, but that was, I mean, growing up, both in school and then studying in high school and studying college, when I looked at it more academically, the idea was that it should be a bit difficult, because democracy is something you should, story. Of course, nobody was talking about the situation in the South where people were killed for trying to vote, or had to have the right to vote. But there's something sort of, and again, I think is changing very quickly now, especially with the younger generation who sees no reason for this, but the older generations themselves will say, no, but it should be require an effort. And I mean, I remember going to the courthouse, and it was a bit of, it was an achievement and so forth, but it doesn't have to be that way. And then in Sweden, you're automatically registered. But the thing is that throughout segregation, and then especially since the adoption of the Southern Strategy, and then the last few years of what we call voter suppression, where you actively you target Black, Latino, whatever groups that you think are going to vote against Republicans, and you try to make it difficult for them to vote, exactly like it was in the South before 1964, 1965. Um, so this is to have automatic vote. The only exception to that was during the Clinton administration, where he had you could register to vote when you got your driver's license. And the idea there was because they were trying to get away, they were actually trying, in those days, they were trying to expand the number of voters, the people, trying to get people to vote. Because in the 50s, thought, people don't need to vote because everybody loves the system. And then by the 80s, found out this wasn't the case. So there was a voter drive trying to get Black people, trying to get women, trying to get everybody to vote. And the Clinton administration, I thought it was quite good, came up with this brilliant idea. Well, in America, like, not 100%, but a vast majority of people have a driver's license. You have to have one in America. And these are state issued. Well, you go renew your driver's license in America every 2 years or 3 years or whatever. So you go to your state highway office, and you get your license, and they say, would you like to register to vote? And get a piece of paper and you sign it, and Bob's your uncle, as they used to say. But that obviously disappeared somewhere in the voter suppression thing. And this is in a way in a much more sensible and far-reaching attempt to, you just have this like in Sweden of an automatic voter registration, and you can opt out of it if you want to, but you're in it. So you don't
Yeah,
have to, because it's so time consuming. Everything, this all goes back to when America was an agrarian country at the end of the 18th century. And it all made sense at that time. A lot of these things made sense, just like inaugurating the president in January after the election was in November, and before it was in March when you had the inauguration. These things made sense, but they don't make sense anymore. And things can be changed. And this whole automatic voter registration, the solution. But of course, Republicans who are afraid of people voting, um, they want to limit it as much as possible. And as I say, I think it's 135 different measures being in the process in Republican states, making it difficult for people to vote. You have to have an ID. You have to have a certain idea. Aha, did you? And that's another thing in America, because if you move from one place to another, and if you move out of state, then there's different rules that apply. And maybe you didn't live there long enough and you left your other state, so you can't vote anywhere. And people are studying, people go away to college to study. And this is where Obama, the campaign made great inroads, because they registered people like crazy, and they had information campaigns and everything to make sure that people knew where they could vote or how they should vote, or where they should vote. And that's really been dismantled throughout the Trump administration, and then the COVID crisis added to this. But so you're right. This is a very important provision, and something which really everybody should be for.
Yeah. And I think there's been a shift in like the basic values, like basic ideas about voting and voting rights and who should be able to vote. Like you said, back in like the 1700s, restricting the vote was seen as necessary and good because not everyone was supposedly fit to vote. But I think the basic assumption today is that everyone should have the right to vote,
Oh.
unless there's very, very good reason to deny them the right to vote. And in that context, when that's like the guiding value, things like restricting the practical ability of people to actually vote, to cast a vote, by just making it impossible to register or tricking people into thinking that that they've done what they need to vote, but like letting them know on election day basically that no, you have to do this and this and this as well.
You shooting
Like
somewhere
that's
else.
it seems unfair, and it all seems like dirty tricks, and I don't think anyone really think that this is what it's supposed to look like in a free and fair system.
No.
And that's good news. Like before you can pass like sweeping policy changes, you need like support from the public.
Exactly.
And the more people talk about this, the harder it's going to be to long term shut stuff like this down.
Yeah.
I think. And especially like when it comes to voter registration, when it's something that has such like historical baggage,
Well.
and has been used in and still today, that's important to point out, there are certain groups that are targeted by these tactics.
Oh yeah.
It has a racist history, and is used to promote like racist. I don't want to sound too harsh here, but the consequences of this are like
Yeah,
definitely.
no, definitely. I mean, it is racist in origin. I mean, they're not. I mean, these different voter suppression things, and one can do it much more effectively now in the computer age because they are specifically targeting. And I heard a program about it, how it was. I think it was outside of Dallas, and it had to do with redistricting and everything. And there's a whole vocabulary talking about this. I didn't understand half of it, but it's highly technical and mathematical how you target these different groups. And it is racial groups. It is primarily African Americans or people you think might be voting against you. And the fact that it is targeted is it's racially targeted, and that it should be unconstitutional. And in fact, there was a special, that was the purpose behind the Special Voting Rights Act, as you know, from 1965, because 64 did away with discrimination. But then there had to be a special act passed in 65 saying that the federal government had the right to review what was going on in the states. And if they could find laws, voter laws that were targeted against African Americans, I forget all the details of it, then this was unconstitutional. So why don't we use the Voting Rights Act of 65 anymore?
Well, this is one of the great tragedies of the Obama years. Back in 2013, the Supreme Court heard a case concerning Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the one you're talking about, and they decided that basically it's a bunch of legal mumbo jumbo, but simply put, the criterion for determining who was affected by Section 5, which which district was affected, was deemed unconstitutional. So Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is still in effect, but at the moment it's unenforceable because you can't actually determine who to apply it to.
Right.
And this whole pre-clearance thing was like the main thing blocking changes in voting laws, voter registration laws, and stuff like that, which could be determined as racist. And since 2013, when this was struck down, there's no way federally to stop racist or otherwise bigoted election practices.
Yeah, targeted.
And the reasoning for getting rid of, of this provision in the Voting Rights Act was that times have changed. We don't have a problem with racism anymore, so this isn't this isn't necessary, and therefore, since people aren't misbehaving anymore, this is now unconstitutional. And as we can plainly see, like after this latest election, that's just not the case. This is it's still an ongoing thing, and we don't live in a post-racial society, and we won't anytime soon. Not even here in Sweden, no matter what people seem to think. So this kind of legal protections, they should have realized right away that stripping this away was a bad thing. It was done by courts and not by politicians. And politicians can repair this damage. And I think this bill is a good step towards that.
Definitely. No, I mean, I remember it raised eyebrows, or at least some people's eyebrows, including my own, when the decision was made that, times have changed, and hey, if we have a black president, so everything is fine. Raised eyebrows in 2013, and then, I mean, that was, and then Trump has made it worse, of course. But I mean, it's important to point out, this is a Supreme Court decision. So, and again, for me, from my generation, people look to the Supreme Court to guarantee civil rights and human rights. Now the Supreme Court is actually making voter suppression easier. Because say after they basically made the Voting Rights Act of 65 ineffective, then you can't say, well, this targets black people, even though it does, because no, we've said we've moved on from that, so it doesn't happen. And in fact, there's a couple cases being heard by the Supreme Court now, which is even more conservative than it was during Obama, and about Arizona. And it has to do with these details, like if both Arizona and Georgia are sort of at the forefront of trying to get to limit voting possibilities, which is interesting. And again, it's sort of self-defeating because these are the two states that went Democratic after being anyway. But so the Republicans there are trying to, they have voter restriction laws, and they're being heard by the Supreme Court now. And it'll be very interesting, which has it has a very clear majority. And I'm guessing they're going to decide in favor of these voter restriction laws in Arizona, and then there'll be a strong minority dissent on the Supreme Court. And historically, sometimes dissents turn out to be more, but you have a situation where the Supreme Court is actually agreeing with this voter restriction, whereas the legislature seems to be, or certainly the House of Representatives, moving forward to ensure voter rights. So it's an interesting situation.
Yeah, and it's the way they're doing it by making a universal thing is kind of smart, because this will make it harder to challenge. Like the reason why the Section 5 pre-clearance was struck down was because it supposedly unfairly targeted certain certain districts.
Yeah.
And national automatic voter registration won't specifically target anyone. Like it's fairly clear who will be like most affected by it, but it won't be like a law specifically written targeting certain geographic spaces. It's so it's a smart way to do it, and also like bad election practices isn't a problem exclusively in the South either. There's a lot of places around the country, around America, where this is a problem. So just guaranteeing it across the board for everyone, that's smart and good.
Right, it's a sensible solution.
Yeah.
And then there's a third, I could go on about that, but a third important ingredient, which also ties in with recent history, and that is to, as you know, to make voting by mail or online voting, which is more and more happening in America anyway. People, I think there's 6 states that already have it's only online or voting. I mean, anyway, but that's another provision in this act to make it much easier to people to vote by mail or by online, or you don't have to actually go to the voting place, wait for 8 hours. That's another thing in America is, I mean, in all elections, it's taken for granted you can, which is the election is the federal elections are held on a work day, which makes it nice. So you try to show up to the polls on time. You can be waiting for 5-6 hours.
Yep.
If you're lucky, you might get in, or if you're unlucky, it might be raining, etc., etc. But that's why people, just like in other places, it's easier to vote online or vote by mail. And that was an enormous, that it was really interesting in this election during COVID-19 pandemic, that there was this enormous increase in the number of voters, people who actually voted. And then this is mainly due to having this option of voting by mail or voting online, or, you know, these various other options that are there instead of actually going to your polling place, which in Texas, they moved them around. They tried to close half of them. I mean, it's just so obvious. But I mean, even under normal circumstances, these are changes that any modern democratic country would like to make, and it's a very important provision in this bill that yeah, they have to be there, and the states have to inform you about this, exactly what you need to do, exactly what you yeah, the process to go through. And in some states, like, I mean, I read California's rules about this leading up to the election last year, and it's very specific, and everything's online, and you do this, that, and the other thing. And, you know, what's the problem? And again, this is something Donald Trump, who votes by mail, of course, he was against all this. And then you always have the irony of that people say, well, wouldn't Republican voters be affected by this? Yes. But obviously there's a certain amount of, you know, friendly fire or something that elderly white people who can't get out to vote, we don't need them anyway. But again, it becomes absurd. So this act cuts through all the absurdity and says people have the right to vote online, mail, whatever the technologies allow, and we will help you do that. Which
There's a couple of different things, like voting by mail, making it mandatory to have I think it's like 2 weeks of early voting. You have to be able to go to a place 2 weeks before the election, or 15 days before the election, and this election place has to be open for 10 hours a day at least, and also making election day a federal holiday. That's another thing. All of these things would make it infinitely easier for working people to actually be able to make it to the polls and vote. And this is important because Black people aren't the only ones who have been disenfranchised historically. Like poor people couldn't vote either in general, back in the day. And like the same thing with women, but it's for fairly obvious reason. it's much harder to get away with discriminating against female voters. You can't can't do that in a way that's not entirely obvious. So
I'm sure there's a Republican legislature somewhere which would no, I shouldn't.
oh yeah, there's definitely kooks out there who think that women shouldn't have the right to vote.
No, but yeah.
Yeah, but like just making it practically impossible for people like working people to actually go to a place and cast a vote. That's a huge problem as well. Like I've seen those queues as well, like 6, 7, 8 hour queues.
Yeah. This is normal.
Yeah, and it's like really bad because that's gonna drive down like the determination of people to actually go make their voices heard. So all of these things, vote by mail, early voting, making election day a holiday,
yeah, definitely,
stuff like that's incredibly valuable.
right.
And
You know,
it's
if
going to
all
make
those things were implemented, those three main things, there's other things as well. I mean, they would, I mean, turnout would increase dramatically.
yeah,
You know, even more than it did now. But this is also why, if you had at a federal election, at a presidential election, if you had 50% of eligible voters, no, 50% of the voting, yeah, of eligible voters voting, if you had 50%, that was good.
yeah.
That was a good turnout. In some countries, that would be seen as being sort of a failure. But and then it increased during the last election. But no, I mean, just make it easy to vote, you know. And this is what the underlying philosophy of this act is. And yes, you would see a dramatic upturn in the number of people who would go and vote, and that really would be of great importance for democracy. You could have a whole new sort of political situation in the United States, and it's not Republican or Democrat, but I mean people involved in democracy, and maybe representatives becoming more accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. And like this is the reason why Republicans are quite aggressively targeting people's right to vote. Like you mentioned Georgia and Arizona.
Right.
Like both of those states are they're going to turn blue. At the moment, they're swing states, but
I
they're
know.
going to be blue states fairly soon. So,
Oh,
and like this is the battle. It's going to be fought by Republican local Republican lawmakers
right.
passing provisions trying to keep people from voting,
Yeah.
and and Democrats for like a couple of months now, or like maybe 2 years until the next election. Democrats in the House trying uh,
Yeah.
to make it easier for people to vote and
Right.
make democracy accessible to the people.
Right.
And it's quite dramatic. And
It is.
like this, if this bill were to pass, the results would be dramatic.
It would be definitely. I mean, the
Uh,
long term, not just the 2022, but I mean the long term. I mean, America would become really a functioning democracy. As we mentioned in the very first video, the United States is listed by the economists. Oh, there's two organizations that measure democracy in countries across the world, and America has gone down from a functioning democracy, from a full democracy to a flawed democracy. It used to be at the very top of a full democracy, depending on the metrics that they use. And this would be a step up from being a flawed democracy to being a fully working democracy. So it is very important. We'll see what happens in the Senate. A lot depends, I think, on Amy Klobuchar, this nice Midwesterner, who's head of the Rules Committee. One can't expect too much, but what I would like to see is Amy Klobuchar saying, just like Bernie in the Budget Committee, okay, I'm in charge of the Rules Committee. This is a very powerful position. And you can't tell me there's not somewhere in the Senate rule book which everybody protects like the Bible or the Gutenberg Bible, somewhere there's some rules that say, you know, under these circumstances, we only need a simple majority. And I wish she would look for that. I wish she would use her power to do that.
I
I
think there's a good chance she
who
will,
who
because
knows? I mean, we're in new times.
yeah, and she's nothing if not ruthless. Like
Oh,
Amy Klobuchar is a
but
real
she seems so
fighter.
nice.
Yeah, yeah, she seems nice,
I
but
saw her the first when she was campaigning in the primaries, and she appeared in snow. I'm a Midwesterner, in the snow and everything, and I knew nothing about her, but I thought I liked her.
yeah, well, she's polite and she seems nice, but she's fierce. She's fierce and ruthless, and
Okay.
I uh, I don't have any doubt that if she wants to fight for this, she's going to, and she's not going to give up. And like the only real question is, uh, does she want it? But as leader of the rules committee, I don't think she's going to accept being pushed around either.
Oh no,
I
she
think
shouldn't.
just if nothing else, just out of straight ego, she's going to put up a fight. And
Oh, good.
um, this is just my like take on
Oh,
her personal psychology, of course.
uh,
So it's
yeah. No, I forgot. She got into trouble with. There was some scandal about her staff
yeah,
in Minnesota or in Congress. She threw something and she was angry with them. So,
yeah, she threw a stapler at someone.
okay, that says something. It's a nice
Yeah,
Midwesterner. Okay, so we'll see what happens. Oh, I think we've been talking for more than an hour again, but it's a very important topic, and hopefully everybody will watch the entire video. I just thought I'd mention at the end that this is only one part of this Voting Rights Act. The other two parts, which we can talk about later sometime, one is campaign finance reform,
yeah.
which in itself would be an enormous act by itself. And then the third one is about government ethics, and we haven't even talked about them.
Yeah,
No, the most important thing is this, what we talked about, or the most topical, but the other. So if you can implement all those things, so
yeah. It's going to be
mm,
a beautiful thing. I just want to add one thing.
yeah,
There's also a provision in the bill making it mandatory to restore voting rights for convicted felons
yes,
served time, which is also like, to me as an outsider, should be like a no-brainer. If you served your time,
yeah,
like I even feel that it's kind of absurd to refuse people the right to vote if they're in prison. Like, everyone should have the right to vote,
yeah,
no exceptions, basically. But that's it's a good first step.
yeah,
There's no reason why people should lose their democratic
mm,
rights for life,
right,
just because they've been convicted of a crime like once
yeah.
during their
That's it.
lifetime. And also that's another thing that that's like clearly has racist results,
Oh yeah,
because of racist policing um, and stuff like that. So disproportionately affects Black people, and it
yeah,
needs to be fixed.
yeah.
This bill will do that as well.
That's a touchy subject in American politics. Do you remember during the primaries when Bernie Sanders said that all felons, that everybody in prison should have the right to vote, and he almost had to walk that back.
Yeah,
Because of the pushback. And again, if you live in other democracies who don't have these rules, you think, well, but people say, what, felons? And so, yeah, and I remember with the Bernie thing was even somebody who committed an act of violence, and Bernie being sort of, I mean, consistent to his views, said, yeah. And then people were saying, oh, yeah, don't get into that, you know. And then they talked about him and Venezuela and everything. But it's a touchy subject. But no, it doesn't have any place in a functioning democracy. But Yeah, we'll see what happens, and if that becomes part of the debate, it'd be unfortunate if that would be the only thing that people focus on, because that's not the main issue.
Yeah,
But,
it's probably going to be made an issue, um, but like we said earlier, like values change over time, and
yeah,
I like people have been made aware of the problem, especially like when it comes to racism in the justice system and
right.
stuff like that. And
Yeah,
if everyone agrees that that's a problem, they basically have to all agree that this disproportionately affects certain
right.
groups of people, and then they might be more open to a discussion,
Oh,
hopefully. But
yeah,
but yeah, there's
definitely. And the American prison system affects a large percentage of the American population. And more people in prison than per capita than um, most other
yeah,
democracies. I forget the figures, but it's pretty
it's like,
high. That's another topic one can talk about. Yeah.
oh, I think I'm losing my connection.
Okay, we don't want that to happen. Um,
No,
can you hear me?
I can hear you at least.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, maybe we should sign off. Is that okay if we do that now?
yeah,
Although it seems we're right in the middle of a
absolutely.
very interesting discussion, but we'll return to this subject later. And for the time being, just monitor what's going on, and then we'll get back to viewers about this at a later date. But certainly there'll be another video next week on some other important and interesting topic. So thank you, Anders, for our discussion today. It was
Thank you,
informative
Daniel.
and entertaining as usual, but really enjoyed discussing these things with each other. So I'm glad we can do that. Um, okay, so I guess we'll say goodbye. I will stop recording, and we look forward to seeing people. Where's the button? Yeah, seeing people next week. Okay, bye for now.